Well, hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us for Volume Online. For those of you who are tuning in with your small groups in your host homes, we're so glad to have you following along with us as we continue in this series called I'm In. For the last 3 weeks, we've been exploring these I N statements that are rooted in the truth of our identity and our relationship with the church and the body of Christ. And we started things off by acknowledging the truth that each of us is invited to be a part of the church and to be a part of the body of Christ. But secondly, each of us are invaluable to the body of Christ, and each of us has influence in the church. But tonight, I want to talk about the idea of being invested in the church. Because you may have heard this before, the importance of being invested, the importance of having skin in the game, the importance of being all in. Whether this is with an organization or an event or a project, to be invested in that thing. And often we think of, in terms of financial investment, this is often portrayed as somebody will give a certain percentage or amount of financial capital, of money, in the hopes and anticipation of a return on that investment. That initial investment will be expanded, will grow larger, there will be a return, there will be a certain amount of financial gain from that investment. So what does it mean for us to be invested in the church? Because several of us may think to ourselves, well, I don't feel invested in the church. I don't really feel like I'm participating. I don't feel like I'm really putting anything into this. But if we're not putting anything in, how can we expect to get anything out of being a part of the church, being a part of a small group, being invested in the body of Christ? Because the truth of the matter is, all of us are invested in something. But the problem is, many of us are invested in things that don't last. And what is the most valuable commodity that you have to invest in this life? It's your time and it's your attention. So even right now where you may be thinking to yourself, well, there's no way that I can contribute or invest financially in the church. That's not all you're called to invest. You have your attention and you have your time. And these are the two most valuable commodities that you have to spend in this lifetime. So in Matthew chapter 6, we can take a look at what exactly it means to invest in the church, to invest in eternal things. Chapter 6, verse 19, Jesus says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Where your investment is, there your heart will be also. Where you spend your time, where you spend your attention, that is where your heart will be also. Are you investing in things of this world, things that are finite, things that will waste away, things that will not last? Or do you want to be invested in eternity, in eternal things? Because our God has created us not to store up riches, just as he tells us in Matthew. Do not store up treasures and riches for yourself here on earth, but in fact to pour out the blessings that we've been given. Because we understand that every good thing that we have in this life has been given to us directly from God. Every good thing and every blessing that we have has been poured out to us. And we are not called to simply store these things up for ourselves, but we are called to multiply. We are called to continue the process in pouring this out to others. In Luke chapter 12, Jesus tells the parable of a rich young farmer. He says, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, 'What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops.' Then he said, 'This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, This very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. So there's two mindsets that I want to explore here. When it comes to generosity, when it comes to investment, there's a scarcity mindset. It's a mindset where we think to ourselves, I want to give, but I don't have enough. Now, I'm the oldest of 4 siblings, and any of you guys who are siblings, you know that in a household with a lot of siblings, there's a limited amount of resources, and often it feels like we have to compete with each other for those limited resources. And in the same way, there's a scarcity mindset that some of us never grow out of, even into our adult life. We think, if only I had more, I need to have more. What I have, I need to cling to. I can't think of being generous until I have more. And then this turns into an if-when idea. If I had more, an if-then idea. If I had more, then I would be generous. When I have more, when I accumulate more wealth, then I will be more generous. I wish I could be generous with my time, but I don't have enough. I wish I could be generous with my resources, but I don't have enough. This is a scarcity mindset, and it's a mindset that's driven by fear. But when you have a scarcity mindset, it holds you back from the blessing of blessing others, because it gives you a mindset and a lifestyle of keeping and safeguarding and securing and protecting and storing what you have. But God did not create us to store blessings. He created us to pour blessings. And so the second mindset, so we have the scarcity mindset, and there's a second one. It's in a mindset of abundance, an abundance mindset. This is where we can acknowledge and understand that everything that I have, everything that I am able to enjoy in this life was given to me by the one who holds everything. Think of that. God is lacking in nothing. He's not missing anything. He gives abundantly because everything that we could possibly enjoy is his to give. And when we have an abundance mindset, it's acknowledging that God already owns it. The things that I want to cling onto, the blessings that I want to store up for myself, God already owns all of those things. What I have from God, it's not a scarcity mindset. It's a mindset. It's an acknowledgement of knowing that this is more than enough. What I have is more than enough. And if I'm being called to be generous, it's a call to be generous with what I have. In Mark 14, a couple weeks ago, we talked about the story about a very unassuming character in the New Testament, where we see Jesus residing in a Pharisee's home. While these Pharisees are out in this outer room, and they're engaging in dialogue of politics and religion, and they're reclining and they're eating. And a woman comes with a jar of expensive perfume. And from the text, we can tell that this jar of perfume was the most valuable thing she owned. She didn't have much. She didn't come from much. But everything that she had, she brought with her. And she walked a long distance to see Jesus. And when she found Jesus, she wept and she wiped his feet with her hair and with her tears. And she poured this jar of expensive perfume over him. And we see Judas, one of Jesus' disciples, is with him at this time. And we see Judas with a scarcity mindset, big surprise there, where he actually criticizes this action, where he actually criticizes the woman's generosity towards Jesus and says, "You foolish woman." He reprimands her and says, "You could have sold this expensive perfume in the market, and we could have used that money, that abundance of money, to feed people, to put towards these other projects." But Jesus looks at Judas and he says, "What she has done will be told around the world." Because God the Father has called us to pour our blessings, not to store our blessings. And we see this best demonstrated in Luke chapter 9, the story of the feeding of the 5,000. If you've grown up in the church, you've likely heard this, but maybe not in this context or with this perspective. You see, historians believe that at the time when this took place, when Jesus fed the 5,000, he was speaking to a crowd. He was preaching to what we believe to be the largest crowd that he ever spoke to at any one time. The text records that there were 5,000 people present, but we need to remember, during this time in history, only the men would have been counted in a crowd. So there were 5,000 men accounted for, but we don't account for the women and the children. And there were likely just as many women as there were men, so that's another 5,000. And there were likely twice as many children than there were men or women. So right here, we're looking at, we estimate a crowd of about 15 to 20,000 people, and Jesus has been preaching to these people all day. And from the tone of the text, it sounds like it's one of those sermons that's kind of been drawing on and on and on a little longer than it should. And at one point, the disciples come to him and they're kind of like, hey, Jesus, I think we need to give the crowd a little break. We need to send them home so that they can hit Applebee's and get some dinner. Verse 12 says, late in the afternoon, the 12 came to him and said, send the crowd away so they can go to the surrounding villages and countryside and find food and lodging, because we are in a remote place here. Jesus replied, you give them something to eat. They answered, we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, unless we go and buy food for all this crowd. See, right away, the disciples are responding with a scarcity mindset. Jesus is giving them the opportunity to be generous, and the disciples are saying, we don't have enough to be generous. And so Jesus, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke them. Then he gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. So you see here, there's very obviously a miracle that took place. And in this process, we see 3 things happen. Jesus took what they had, and all they had, he blessed it. But then he gave it to the disciples to distribute throughout the crowd. And so it's not just that Jesus performed a miracle to feed the crowd, but he allowed the disciples to engage and participate in such a beautiful way in this miracle. He blessed the food. He blessed it. The disciples gave it. And when they gave it, God multiplied it. And in the same way, we need to consider our blessings. What Jesus blesses in our lives, what God blesses in our lives, and what we choose to give, God will multiply. That's what generosity is. That's what biblical generosity is. If you want to be invested in your small group, in your church, in this ministry, if you want to invest yourself, it's not about waiting around until you have more than enough to be generous with. It's about being generous with what you have right now. Because God has blessed you. And if you take what you've been blessed with and you engage in the miracle of generosity by giving that, God will multiply it. He is faithful to multiply it. He is faithful to allow you to engage in the miracle of generosity. Because generosity is not just an action, it's a posture of the heart. Generosity is a mindset. When we are invested in the church, we recognize that what God pours out to us flows through us. And we are called to give in the same manner that we receive. When it comes to love, we understand that we have been given love freely and without condition. And we are called to let that love flow from us, to love others freely and without condition, to offer forgiveness, to offer grace freely and without condition. Every blessing that God pours out to us flows through us and is multiplied to the people around us and in our lives. So what has God blessed you with? What has God allowed you to be generous with? Because even if you're thinking to yourself, well, I don't have any money to be generous with, What about your time? What about your attention? What about your words of affirmation? What about your encouragement? God has blessed you with things that you may not even recognize. How can you take a step back and acknowledge those blessings and then consider how you can turn and allow those blessings to flow through you to bless others? So that we're not so focused on storing up treasures for ourselves in this life, but being eternity-minded with a mindset of abundance. Thank you guys for joining us this week. We're excited to see you next time.